The crowd gathered long before dawn. By sunrise, the streets of Rome were already trembling beneath the weight of sandals and shouts. Men, women, and children pressed shoulder to shoulder, their eyes glinting with hunger, not for food but for shame. Because in ancient Rome, cruelty was not hidden. It was performed. The clang of iron echoed across the marble. Chains scraped the stone steps as prisoners were dragged into the open square. A woman's scream split the air, but no one turned away. Instead they leaned closer. In the empire that conquered the world, there was no greater punishment than humiliation. No sharper weapon than disgrace. The Romans called it iustitia, justice. But their justice had an audience. The Forum became a theater of shame, where every punishment was designed not merely to wound the body, but to destroy the soul. Nobles stripped of their dignity before slaves, soldiers whipped before the men they once commanded, lovers exposed for sins the empire itself committed in secret. Every humiliation was a reminder, you are small and Rome is eternal. Imagine the sun burning high above the Colosseum. The scent of sweat, blood and dust mixing in the air. A soldier kneels, trembling as the centurion raises the lash, not for treason but for laughter during a sacred ceremony. One mistake, one misplaced smile, and the crowd now cheers his agony. Every strike echoes through the stone arches, swallowed by the roar of thousands who came not to see justice, but to feel superior to it. And then her. A noblewoman once praised for her beauty, now dragged through the Forum in tattered silk. Her jewels stripped, her hair cut away in clumps by mocking hands. She tries to hide her face, but Roman law demanded that shame be seen. Children throw fruit, men shout slurs, senators watch in silence. For her, death would have been mercy. But in Rome, mercy was weakness, and weakness was the greatest sin of all. The empire had built roads that reached the ends of the earth. But its true foundation was cruelty, the kind that wore a smile. Because the Romans didn't just punish. They performed punishment. They turned pain into entertainment, humiliation into ritual. They made suffering beautiful, at least to the ones watching. They believed that public disgrace restored balance. That when one man's pride was shattered, the gods were satisfied. But behind the spectacle, behind the chanting and laughter, something darker was taking root, a hunger for degradation itself. It no longer mattered whether the accused was guilty or not. What mattered was the performance, and how far it could go before the crowd looked away. But they never did. So I'll ask you this. Was this justice, or a civilization confessing its own sickness in front of the world? Because as centuries passed, the crowds only grew louder. The punishments became crueler. And the Romans, once known for their law, their architecture, their art, became addicted to the destruction of dignity. They called it justice. But in ancient Rome, justice was a stage performance, and humiliation was the star act. What began as punishment soon became Rome's favorite form of entertainment, and what they did to their own people will make your blood turn cold. The Rome of emperors and legions was not merely a city. It was an idea, a living god draped in marble and blood. From the Palatine Hill to the lowest slum, every breath carried the weight of hierarchy. The powerful ruled through spectacle, the powerless survived through silence. Every Roman, from slave to senator, lived beneath one sacred law, dignitas, the honor that made a man worthy of Rome itself. But honor had a twin, pewter, the shame that devoured those who lost it. In Rome, to lose one's dignity was not to die, it was to vanish from existence. Your name could be erased from inscriptions, your face from mosaics, your deeds from memory. That was the true death. And it is here that Rome found its most intoxicating weapon, public humiliation. Because Rome understood something chilling, fear of pain fades but fear of shame never does. And so, they turned that fear into policy. Every punishment, every trial, every ritual of disgrace was not just justice, it was performance. Hear ye, Marcus, son of Decimus, charged with cowardice before the eyes of Rome. The crowd gathers. A soldier stands trembling, stripped of armor. His comrades watch, their gazes cold. The centurion steps forward, carrying a bundle of rods. The fasces, the symbol of state power, each rod representing the right to flog, to humiliate, to destroy a man's pride. With every strike, the rods sing through the air, and the soldiers' cries rise with them. Not because of the pain, but because every citizen who hears them now knows his shame. That was the genius and the horror of Roman order. Punishment wasn't hidden in prisons. It was brought to the heart of the city, to the forum, to the amphitheater, to temples themselves. The gods were the audience, the people were the jury. Justice was public, merciless, and deeply personal. But humiliation wasn't only for traitors or soldiers. It reached into every class, every home, every life. Debtors who couldn't pay were paraded naked through the streets, their foreheads branded with letters that marked them as failures for eternity. Slaves caught stealing were whipped before their masters and neighbors, their screams echoing against stone walls that had seen centuries of the same. Women accused of adultery were dragged from their homes and stripped of their jewelry, their beauty turned against them as evidence of sin. For the Romans, this wasn't cruelty, it was morality in action. To be shamed was to be corrected. To be humiliated was to be purified before the gods. That's how they justified it. Every lash, every jeer, every public display of disgrace, they called it the restoration of order. But beneath the surface of that order, something was changing. The people had begun to enjoy it. What started as deterrence became ritual. What began as justice became entertainment. And the rulers saw it. They saw how crowds cheered louder with every humiliation, how senators watched longer when the punishment turned crueler. So they fed that hunger. The Colosseum wasn't just built for blood. It was built for display. For Rome, to watch was to rule. Every scream, every act of degradation confirmed the empire's power. In the shadow of its pillars, humiliation became theater, refined, organized, perfected. Yet even then the empire believed it was righteous. They said public punishment reminded citizens of virtue, of obedience, of their place in the chain of command. Because Rome was obsessed with hierarchy, from emperor to senator, from soldier to slave, every rank depended on the visible suffering of those below. A society built on humiliation needed humiliation to survive. Imagine standing in that crowd, the sun blinding your eyes, the heat baking the stones beneath your feet. A man kneels before the magistrate, his head bowed, his voice shaking as he begs for mercy. And as the rods strike his back, you hear the crowd roar, not in pity but in triumph. Because in that moment Rome had reaffirmed itself. It had proved that mercy was weakness and weakness was death. And yet, the more they humiliated, the less human they became. Each act of disgrace chipped away at the soul of the empire, until Rome itself began to rot from the inside out. It didn't know it then. But every public shaming, every parade of pain, was a rehearsal for its own fall. Because soon humiliation wasn't enough. Rome demanded something grander, something spectacular. If shame could no longer satisfy the crowd, then blood surely would. And so the stage changed. The Forum became the Colosseum. The punishment became performance. And shame turned to horror. And it was in those arenas, the narrator whispers, that Rome revealed its truest face, not the face of glory but the face of cruelty, worshipped as law. In the heart of Rome's marble empire, there was another city unseen, a city of punishment. A place where virtue was tested not by courage, but by how long one could endure humiliation before breaking. At dawn the Forum Romanum came alive. Merchants set up stalls, senators strode in flowing togas, and in the center, bound to wooden pillars, stood the condemned. They were slaves. Property. Forgotten souls whose suffering entertained the free. A Roman lictor, the official executor, would raise his whip, leather cutting through morning air. Each strike was not just pain. It was erasure. For in Rome, when a slave screamed, it wasn't defiance, it was silence in disguise. They were expected to suffer quietly, as though agony itself were a civic duty. Some were branded with the letter F. For fugitivus, runaway. The flesh sizzled, the crowd jeered, and the smoke carried the scent of fear. To be marked in Rome was to live as a walking warning. They had no names, only screams that the wind would swallow. And yet, if you listen closely, you can almost hear their voices echo through the centuries. Not as criminals, but as human beings, stripped of dignity in the name of order. Then came the spectacle of shame reserved for women, and for the men who failed to control them. Adultery was not just betrayal, it was treason against Roman virtue. And punishment was theater. In one recorded case, a noble woman, once draped in jewels, was paraded through the streets in rags, her hair torn, her body bruised. Crowds gathered as if for a festival. Children laughed. Men spat. She tried to cover her face, but the guards forced her hands down, because shame in Rome had to be seen. Her husband watched from a balcony. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He simply turned away, for to show emotion was weakness. Rome called it justice. But what kind of justice demanded a woman's humiliation to prove a man's honor? This was not punishment, it was performance. A morality play acted out under a merciless sun, where every tear fed the audience's appetite for control. Even Rome's proudest soldiers were not spared the ritual of shame. Among them existed the most feared sentence of all, the fustuarium. When a man was accused of cowardice, desertion, or theft, he wasn't executed by his enemies, but by his brothers in arms. At dawn, the legion would gather in a silent circle. The condemned would be brought forward, stripped of his armor, his insignia ripped from his chest. Then one by one his comrades would step forward with clubs. There was no command, no mercy, only the slow rhythm of death by shame. The soldiers believed the disgrace of one man could stain the entire legion, and so they purified it with blood. It was said that a true Roman feared dishonor more than the sword, and perhaps that is what made them unstoppable and utterly inhuman at the same time. Because in Rome, dying with shame was worse than dying at all. But humiliation was not only for the powerless. Even the mighty found themselves kneeling before madness disguised as divinity. Caligula, the emperor who once called himself a god, delighted in turning Rome's hierarchy upside down. He ordered senators, Rome's most respected men, to crawl before him like dogs, licking his sandals as the court laughed. One senator hesitated. Caligula smiled and had him executed for arrogance. Nero took it further. He invited Rome's elite to lavish feasts, and in the middle of dinner, forced them to perform in grotesque plays mocking their own dignity. Senators recited humiliating poems about their cowardice while the emperor applauded. Power had become a theater. Humiliation its script. And when an empire begins to find pleasure in degradation, how far can it fall before collapsing into the pit it dug for others? What began as justice became entertainment. What began as order became obsession. Every lash, every sneer, every forced confession, they were not just punishments. They were lessons. Rome taught its people that pain was power, and mercy was weakness. The crowd did not cheer because they hated the condemned. They cheered because for a brief moment, they weren't the ones being humiliated. That was the secret Rome never spoke aloud. So I'll ask you this. Was this justice? Or was this madness disguised as order? If you lived in Rome, would you have joined the crowd? Or looked away? Because what they did next, to traitors, rebels, and even emperors themselves, would echo through eternity. By the time the Roman Empire reached its peak, humiliation had transformed. What began as punishment had become ritual, a language of power spoken through the suffering of others. Rome had mastered not only war and architecture, but performance. Every lash, every chain, every forced bow was no longer spontaneous cruelty, it was choreographed dominance. When a Roman general returned victorious, the city erupted into celebration. But the real spectacle wasn't his parade, it was his prisoners. The conquered king or rebel leader was dragged through the streets, shackled and stripped of every symbol of royalty. They called it the triumph of defeat. And perhaps no story captures Rome's cruelty better than that of Vercingetorix, the proud Gallic leader who dared to defy Julius Caesar. Once a warrior who commanded thousands, he was displayed before Rome's roaring crowd, a living trophy. They paraded him through the forum, his golden armor replaced by chains, his eyes sunken from months in a dungeon. He was made to walk beneath the arch that bore his conqueror's name, while Caesar stood above, bathed in rose petals and cheers. When the parade ended, the crowd fell silent. Vercingetorix was taken beneath the Capitoline Hill, and strangled to death. No sword. No ceremony. Just the slow, deliberate theft of breath, the final act in Rome's favorite play. That was the essence of Rome. Even death had to be theatrical. Even defeat had to entertain. Public humiliation evolved into a sacred form of control. Each punishment carried a symbolic message, to the gods, to the emperor, to the people. To flog a soldier was to purify a legion. To parade a nobleman was to cleanse corruption. To crucify a rebel was to remind the world that rebellion ended in spectacle. The arenas weren't built for blood alone. They were temples of order, where violence and virtue were stitched together into a performance of power. And in those arenas, humiliation wasn't just physical. It was spiritual annihilation. The condemned were stripped not only of life but of identity. Their names were erased from records. Their families forbidden to mourn them. Their faces left to fade into the dust. They didn't just destroy bodies, they erased identities. Rome believed that to erase one's name was to kill them twice, once in flesh, once in memory. And so came the great paradox of civilization. The empire that gave the world law, architecture, and art, also perfected the art of public degradation. Its justice was majestic and monstrous. How could a people who built aqueducts and libraries also build instruments of torment? How could a culture that worshipped beauty turn humiliation into a national pastime? Perhaps because Rome understood something terrible about human nature. That power isn't real unless someone else has to kneel. They called it discipline. They believed cruelty was a mirror of control, that by breaking others, Rome proved it could never be broken itself. But every scream in the arena, every parade of shame, carved invisible cracks into the empire's soul. Because when you turn suffering into ritual, you begin to worship it. And when a society worships humiliation, it eventually humiliates itself. To Romans, humiliation was more than punishment, it was purification. A sinner humiliated in public was believed to cleanse the moral fabric of the city. It was sacrifice wrapped in spectacle. Priests blessed executions as offerings to the gods. Emperors performed them as acts of divine justice. Crowds watched them as civic duty. Rome convinced itself that cruelty was sacred. And so the people learned to love the sight of suffering, because it made them feel safe, clean, and powerful. But there was always a price. For every victory parade, there came another humiliation. For every emperor who forced others to kneel, came a day when he would kneel himself. Because even Rome couldn't humiliate forever. Eventually, the stage turned on its actors. The emperors who mocked others became the jesters of history. The crowd that once worshipped power began to thirst for the blood of its rulers. What Rome built on humiliation would one day collapse beneath it. If you've made it this far, you've just witnessed the darkest mirror of civilization, where justice turned into theater and humanity was the price of applause. But this is only one story in the vast empire of cruelty that shaped our world. So if you want to uncover the truths history tried to bury, if you want to see how beauty and horror were born from the same hands, subscribe to Disturbing Tale, where we don't just tell history, we resurrect it. Each episode takes you deeper into the ancient world's darkest rituals, forgotten punishments, and untold horrors that built the modern world. So hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and join the order of minds who dare to look where others turn away. Because in the ruins of Rome, our story is just beginning. By the twilight of the empire, Rome no longer needed enemies, it was destroying itself. Its cruelty had become culture. Its thirst for spectacle, an addiction that even the gods could no longer quench. The same arenas that once echoed with victory chants now reeked of decay. The marble that once gleamed under the sun had turned red and dusty. What began as a tool of control had turned into a mirror, reflecting Rome's slow moral collapse. Every emperor who demanded humiliation eventually faced his own. Caligula, mocked in the shadows before his assassination. Nero, fleeing through the night as mobs hunted him, whispering the same words he once shouted from his throne, mercy. The empire that taught the world how to kneel would end on its knees. They called it dignitas, dignity, the foundation of Roman honor. But when public shame became entertainment, dignitas lost its meaning. Men who once governed by law began ruling by fear. Senators became jesters. Generals became executioners. Even the people, once the heart of the republic, became the audience of cruelty. And that is how empires truly fall. Not by invasion or sword, but by the quiet death of empathy. Rome's greatest tragedy wasn't that it fell to barbarians. It's that it fell to itself. To the pride, arrogance, and spectacle it mistook for strength. Empires fall not only by swords, but by the cruelty they begin to enjoy. Imagine one survivor. A former slave, once paraded naked before a laughing crowd. Now old, scarred, and forgotten. He walks through the ruins of the same forum that once broke him. He sees cracked marble, empty seats, and weeds sprouting where emperors once ruled. The silence is louder than the applause ever was. He touches the stones that once held chains and whispers to himself, they thought they were gods, but even gods can bleed. That's how humiliation ends, not with cheers but with echoes. And as the centuries passed, the Colosseum crumbled, but the instinct didn't. Because while the stage changed, the performance survived. Today we no longer gather under Roman suns, but behind screens. The arena has become digital. The audience infinite. We still watch the destruction of others for entertainment. We just call it content. The public shaming of the ancient world has found a new form. Online outrage, cancel culture, humiliation dressed as justice. And just like Rome, we tell ourselves it's necessary, that it's what they deserve. But look closer, and you'll see the same pattern repeating. Power, fear, spectacle, and silence. The ingredients of every fallen empire. Have we really evolved? Or do we still cheer when others are destroyed publicly? Do we still crave humiliation, as long as it isn't our own? History doesn't repeat itself because people forget. It repeats because people remember, and choose to do it again in different forms. Rome fell. but its spirit of spectacle lives on. In our courts, our media, our feeds, and sometimes in our hearts. This has been Disturbing Tale. Where history isn't told, it's resurrected. If this story made you think, if you felt the shadow of Rome's cruelty linger just beyond your screen, then don't let this be the end. Subscribe not for me, but for the ghosts of those whose pain built empires. Every story here pulls back the curtain on civilization's darkest truths, where power met punishment, and humanity became the price of progress. Hit that subscribe button, and walk with me into the ruins, because the past isn't dead, it's just waiting to be remembered. This was Rome, a civilization of light and darkness. A world that built roads to eternity, and arenas to erase humanity. Their monuments still stand, grand, unbroken, eternal. But so do their sins. The stones remember what people forget. The cheers have faded, but the silence still speaks. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes of chains clanging in the dust, of pride turned to pleading, of civilization applauding its own cruelty. History doesn't hide its monsters. It buries them, under marble, under myth, under time. But here, we dig them back up. We give names to the forgotten, and light to the buried truth. Because history isn't about dates and empires. It's about what happens when power forgets mercy. And Rome was the world's greatest reminder of that. This is Disturbing Tale. Where history isn't told, it's resurrected. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt the shadow of ancient cruelty still whisper through the present, then don't just watch. Join the journey. Subscribe not for me, but for those whose voices were silenced. In the name of spectacle, obedience, and fear. Here, every monument tells the truth it was built to hide. And every echo from the past still asks the same question. What kind of world are we building now? Thank you for walking through history's darkest corridors with me. Until the next resurrection. Stay curious, stay haunted, and never stop looking beneath the ruins.